Hey everyone, this is our practice test for evolution. So follow along and I'll go through all the answers, or you can skip ahead to the end, or just fast forward it and look at each page to check all your answers as we go. Okay, so multiple choice to start. The first one is, Australia is believed to have once been part of a giant landmass that comprised all of the land on Earth. This giant landmass is now known as Pangaea. So that's the supercontinent that had every single continent as part of it. Later on, Pangaea split up into Gondwana and Laurasia. Okay, number 2. Which one or more of the following statements are consistent with the theory of plate tectonics? There's more than one answer here. So plate tectonics is how continental drift happens. We don't need to know much of the detail about how it actually works. So the Earth's crust, that one is true. It does consist of about 6 huge plates. There are lots of smaller ones. Plates can move at several kilometres each year. That's definitely false. Remember, plates are only moving a couple of centimetres each year. Or even slower than that. So plates can push against each other, slide past each other, and move away from each other. Yep, that's all true. All the continental plates are constantly moving slowly in one various direction. Okay, number 3. Which of the following statements about fossils are not correct? Dinosaur footprints, they can be a fossil. They're a trace fossil. Plants can be preserved as fossils. That's true. All dead organisms are preserved as fossils. That is wrong. Only a tiny fraction of organisms that die get preserved. You need to have a really specific environment that's really suited to making a fossil. Most other organisms just die and then they get decomposed at the bottom in the dirt or the ocean, wherever they're living. The only parts of animals that can be preserved are their bones. No, we can have imprints and footprints and other impressions. And the size, weight and speed of extinct animals can be estimated using fossils. That is true as well. Okay, number 4. According to fossil evidence, the first living organisms existed on Earth approximately, we want to be thinking about 3.8 billion years ago. That's when the first life evolved. So I'm thinking, no, 4,600 million. That is 4.6 billion. So that's slightly too long ago. So it's somewhere from 3.5 billion to 4 billion. So C's right there. So that was wrong. We want to be looking for about 3.8 billion years ago. Number 5, variation within a species can occur. This is almost thinking back to genetics. So how do different alleles and how does variation get made in a species? Well, mutations, definitely. That's what makes new alleles. Mutations happen by chance. That's true as well, because mutations are random. Variation can occur when gametes get made, which are sperm and eggs. True. That's when mutations can happen. And mutations can happen when the sperm and the egg get fertilized. They could happen then. Mutations can happen essentially at any time. Whenever a cell is copying its DNA, getting ready to divide. So there we go. E is actually the right one there. All of the above. Alright, number 6. The theory of evolution is usually credited to. Unfortunately, it's only Charles Darwin, but remember, definitely Alfred Wallace. He did just as much work as Darwin did. Never forget Alfred Wallace. Okay, 7. Which part of mammals, amphibians, reptiles, and birds share a remarkably similar structure? That is our forearms. Because they are homologous. Number 8. Which of the following has not been observed as evidence to support evolution? So, all our embryos all have gill slits in the early stages. That's true, using comparative embryology. The DNA of humans and chimpanzees is remarkably similar. That's using chemical similarity, so that's true. The necks of giraffes get longer as they get older due to stretching to reach food. That is definitely not what happens. Number 9. A gene pool describes. This is basically saying all of the genetic information for one species or one population. So that one is A. It's not B because it's talking about an individual. It's not C because that's only talking about one chromosome. And D is just completely wrong. And E is just trying to make a joke about pools. Alright. Number 10. Of all the species that have ever lived on Earth, what is the percentage that have become extinct? Well, remember, it's in the high 90s. Somewhere in there. So 100% is the closest. Pretty much every species that has existed is now extinct. But we still have millions left alive today, which is pretty amazing. Okay, 11. Which of the following statements about extinction is not correct? Extinction causes a loss of genetic information from the gene pool. Well, that's true because there's no more gene pool, so that's true. The extinction of species is rare without human intervention. No, species still go extinct, even if we weren't around. A loss of biodiversity can lead to extinction of a species. That's true. And the captivity of animals in zoos can save endangered animals from extinction. Well, that's true as well, because we can breed them in zoos. So, which one is the least correct, I'm now thinking? Well, I'd say A, because it's not really technically true. Extinction causes a loss of genetic information from the gene pool. Well, it causes the whole gene pool to disappear, so probably that's the least correct. Number 12. Which of the following statements about mutation is not correct? This is more from our genetics topic, not really relevant here. But let's do it anyway. Mutation occurs during meiosis. Yes, it can occur at any time cells divide. So that's true. Random and spontaneous mistakes are mutations. Yes. Mutations can be chromosomal or right down at a single gene. That's also true. Mutations are always bad for the organism. No, that one is wrong. Some mutations are beneficial. Like if there's a mutation that causes you to have darker fur, well, not you, but an animal, that's better suited to its environment, that's a positive mutation. Okay, short answer. Which level of classification groups organisms together based on whether they can breed together to make fertile offspring? Well, that's a species. That's the definition of a species. 5 different observations that support the theory of plate tectonics. We only have 3. So we've got the fact that coastlines match up and are complementary to each other. We've also got the fact of biogeography, that many species and fossils are found in different locations on different continents when they could never have travelled there on their own. So the continents must have been joined at one stage. And then we also have records in the rock of things like glaciers moving. And so if there's one glacier that used to cover 5 different continents, well then all those continents were most likely joined together. So records in the rock of things like glaciers. Okay, only 3 for us. We don't need any more detail than that. The giant flightless birds, number 15. So the emu and cassowary are Australian, the kiwi is in New Zealand, the ostrich in Africa, and the rhea in South America. So how can the theory of plate tectonics be used to explain the similarity in their features? This is a classic example of biogeography. So these are very similar birds because none of them can fly, but they now live on completely different continents. So they could never have travelled from South America to Africa to Australia because they can't fly. So they must have all evolved together, or their ancestors evolved together when the continents were joined. So we can say the ancestors evolved when the continents were joined. Okay, how can the absence of birds in the northern hemisphere be explained? Okay, well let's use our knowledge of the supercontinents. So, Australia and New Zealand and Africa and South America, they were all part of Gondwana, which was the supercontinent in the southern hemisphere. So that means that the ancestors of these birds probably evolved on Gondwana. So after the northern hemisphere supercontinent, Laurasia, had split off and it had moved to the north, and then these birds evolved in the south. So they're part of all these continents, but they're not part of North America, and they're not part of Asia or Europe either. So really simply, their ancestors must have evolved on Gondwana. Okay, there's a saying, variety is the spice of life, in number 16. Why is variety within a species so important to its survival? So this is another name for variation. And of course, variation is needed for evolution to happen, because that's what causes some individuals to be fitter than others. So you can really just say it causes differences in fitness. That would be the most simple definition. You don't need to explain the whole process of natural selection in that one. Although variety is necessary for survival, it can be harmful. How can the introduction of new genes into a population by the migration of other individuals of the same species cause harm? Well, if these new individuals bring in some traits that don't help the species to survive, then that would be harmful to the population. So maybe in a desert environment, if a whole lot of individuals arrive in the desert and migrate there, but they're not adapted, like maybe they're covered in fur, in really thick fur, that's not going to help the population. So you could say new genes might reduce the fitness of the population because they're not suited. Explain why the process of natural selection is commonly known as survival of the fittest. Well, this is basically explaining the S part of VISTA. So how does survival and reproduction actually happen? So there's 3 marks, you want to make 3 points. We've already basically talked about it at the start, so we know that individuals have differences in their fitness. I'll just say F for fitness. And then that means in their environment, some have a higher chance of surviving than others. So there's different chance of survival. and then over time, the fittest individuals, they're the ones that are surviving, and they're the ones passing on their traits. So the fittest individuals survive and pass on their genes or their traits. Okay, last page. Number 19. This is a really specific question to Darwin and his trip. So when he went to the Galapagos Islands, which are off South America, what did he observe on the Galapagos Islands that suggested two or more species could have a common ancestor? Well, this is talking about the finches. We don't talk about this. It's a really specific part of his trip, which was important, but there were many other observations he made as well. So he observed the finches, and he saw that on each island, the different finches had slightly different shaped beaks because they'd all adapted to eating a slightly different food on each of the islands. So they had different beaks adapted to different foods, but the rest of the birds were really similar to each other, or the rest of the body. So they were really closely related species, except they must have had some divergent evolution as they landed on each island, or as they evolved on each island. Okay. What is meant by the term common ancestor? This is really just meaning that if you go back in time, two different species were once the same species. Or it means that they've evolved from the same species. Alright, number 20. These two squirrel species of the USA are very similar in appearance, but they live on each side of the Grand Canyon. Okay. So neither squirrel can cross to the other side, but they're not yet regarded as separate species. So if we're thinking about our INNERS acronym for speciation, they've been isolated and natural selection is happening because they look slightly different. But the reproductive barrier hasn't formed yet because they can still actually breed with each other, so they're not a different species. So let's think about what are three selection pressures that could result in these two types of squirrels evolving into two different species. Well, what could affect these squirrels? There are lots of different examples. So think about the environment and how could it change? How could it affect how the squirrels evolve? So things like food sources, temperature. The temperature might change on each side of the canyon. It's probably less likely. Fur color. Maybe certain plants live on certain sides of the Grand Canyon. So then the fur color might change in one of the squirrels. Maybe the soil is different on each side, so their claws are different. Maybe one of them evolves to be able to dig in the softer soil. Maybe their teeth change, depending on what species they're eating. So lots of different types of selection pressures, which just means things in the environment that could affect the survival and the evolution. Okay, what will need to be demonstrated before the two species are regarded as two separate species? This is just what we talked about earlier. There has to be a reproductive barrier to prove that they can't reproduce anymore. So scientists would need to collect some of the squirrels from each of those two populations, see if they can breed. If they can't breed anymore, great, they've become two new species. 21, what is DNA hybridization? We don't do that. 22, what is meant by convergent evolution? When two unrelated species evolve to be more similar. Species. Okay. What are analogous structures? So remember, analogous structures are caused by convergent evolution. So these are structures with the same function, but have evolved separately. They're unrelated. So you could just say unrelated structures with the same function. Like the birds of wings and the birds of wings. The wings of birds and the wings of bats. They would be analogous. Oops. Unrelated structures with the same function. Okay, and 24, what's the worst case scenario for a species whose gene pool is diminished? Well, remember, the gene pool is just all the genes for every individual in that species. Well, if the gene pool goes completely, that species has gone extinct, because there are no more genes left of that species. So extinction is the worst case scenario. Okay. There's our test solutions. And good luck with the rest of your revision.